Welcome to this introductory tour of the Botanic Garden. I'm going to take you on a short tour and introduce you to the history of the garden, its function, how we use it for research and teaching. It's a 40-acre site, so we won't be able to look around all of it today, but I'll show you some of the highlights, some of my favourites, and I hope you'll get the chance to come back and enjoy it yourself as well. So this isn't the original Botanic Garden that Cambridge had. This garden was founded here and opened on this site in 1846. Prior to that, Cambridge had a Botanic Garden up in the centre of town. It was on what's now the new museum site, sort of underneath the zoology building. Now that garden, the original Cambridge Botanic Garden, was a physic garden. And that's where botanic gardens began across Europe. Associated with universities, they were designed to support medical students learning about how to use plants as treatments. So there would be a flower bed of plants that were good for the heart, a flower bed of plants that were good for the liver, and so on. And the students would come and learn to identify the plants and use them as medicine. Now that's what Oxford still has, and it's what some of the older university towns in Europe still have. But here in Cambridge we have something different, and that's because of the inspiration of a man called Henslow. So John Stevens Henslow was Professor of Botany in the university from 1825, and Henslow was convinced that plants were worth studying in their own right, and not just as aids for medical students, and he thought that we had a lot to learn from plants about fundamentals of biology. So he persuaded the university that he needed a much bigger site than that little physic garden. He needed somewhere where he could grow trees, where he could really grow the whole diversity of the plant kingdom. And he persuaded the university to buy this site. It's a 40-acre site, and at the time, of course, it was right outside town. It was farmers' fields, and the university then developed it as the Botanic Garden. Now Henslow was very instrumental in planning the layout and design of the garden, and we'll see that as we walk round in some of the plantings. But I've stopped here at the start to show you what he was thinking could be done. So I'm standing in front of our Terracaria. This is the Caucasian wingnut, and this tree is an original Henslow planting from 1846. It's an absolutely fabulous tree, gorgeous, tall, and really shown off today against the blue sky. Now, when Henslow had this planted, it was known that the Terracaria was a member of the walnut family, the Juglandaceae. But it doesn't have fruit that look anything like the fruit of a walnut. So if I show you the fruit, they're hanging fruits, they've got wings, so it's called Caucasian wingnut because they fly in the wind like a sycamore seed would. He also planted just next to it a black walnut tree that died a few years ago, so I can't show you it now, but it was over here just across the path from the Terracaria. And it has your traditional walnuts, so much bigger animal dispersed fruit. Now scientists knew that the two were in the same family because of similarities in their flowers and in their fruit, but it wasn't until people sampled all the members of the walnut family, including the trees here at the Botanic Garden, and did a DNA-based analysis, that we were able to work out the phylogenetic relationships of these plants. And that showed us actually that the wingnut form, this form, is the ancestral form of fruit in the walnut family, and that the big animal dispersed seed of the walnut that you might eat is something that evolved later. You can only do that kind of research if you have access to the whole group of plants in a family. And that's the sort of thing Henslow was imagining happening when he asked the university to allow him to plant a big botanic garden with lots and lots of plant diversity in it. Let's walk around and have a look at some of his other plantings, and I'll tell you about his design for the garden in more detail. So the map here shows you the whole layout of the garden, and I wanted to show you that it's really in two halves. There's a western half here, and then an eastern half here. And the western half is the half that Henslow laid out. The university bought the whole site, but it didn't invest the money to actually develop the eastern half until the 1950s. So the western half is Henslow's design, and there were some things he did that were amazingly innovative for the time. The biggest of them is that actually there's very few, in fact only one, straight line in the whole garden. So the outside path curves. It's a lovely curving path that runs all the way around the outside, and Henslow laid it out in curves in what's called a garden-esque design, whereas botanic gardens were generally much more about straight lines and regular order beds. So there's the one straight line here, which is the main walk, and otherwise it's all lovely curving paths around Henslow's garden. The eastern half of the garden, so this side of the map, this was laid out in the 1940s and 50s after the university received a bequest, and it has a very different feel to it. If you come to the garden, you'll find that Henslow's 1840s garden has mature trees, it has these curving paths, it has quite a holistic feel to it, whereas the eastern half of the garden was laid out to show set pieces of horticultural or scientific thinking at the time. So there is a fen display, there's a British wild plants garden, there's a scented garden, there's a winter garden, there's a rose garden, but it doesn't have the same sort of whole garden feel to it that Henslow's wonderful 1846 design has. Now we walked from the terra carrier here, and we've now walked down to the start of the main walk here. And in doing so, we walked past a number of trees. Henslow planted trees all the way around the outside here of his curving path. And those trees are laid out in family groups because he wanted people to be able to understand the relationships of the plants. So we started in the walnut family with the terra carrier, we walked past the chestnuts, and we've now got to the limes, the Tiliaceae. And I'm going to show you the oldest tree in the garden, the official first tree, which is a member of that lime family. So I'm standing in front of the official first tree of the garden. That's the lime, common lime, Tilia europaea, behind me. And that was planted on the first day we opened. You can imagine the Vice-Chancellor with a shovel and all the local dignitaries and the local newspaper. No photographs, different age then. But that's our official first tree. And if you look at the Botanic Gardens website or any of our literature, you'll find that they all have a lime leaf logo on them. So our logo is derived from that official first tree. Now the other thing that's nice to see in this position is the old main gate, which is behind me here on the other side. This is the gate of the original Physic Garden that used to be on the new museum site, and it was brought down and installed on this site when we opened here to give that continuity. Unfortunately, we can't use it anymore. It opens into the middle of Trumpington Road, and the council don't like us using it because it causes traffic jams here, but it's still lovely to have it and be able to show it to you. So we're going to go from here, and I'm going to show you some of my favourite trees in the garden, and these are trees that tell special stories about plant evolution as well. We're standing next to three of my favourite trees in the Botanic Garden, and I wanted to show you them all and tell you about their stories. So I'm going to start on my left, and this is Sequoiadendron giganteum, giant redwood. This is the tallest tree in the garden, and it's a fabulous example of how a botanic garden is a living laboratory. So this tree is really special. The giant redwoods were discovered by European science by a man called William Lobb. He was a plant hunter, Victorian plant hunter in the 1840s and 50s, who'd been sent out by the nursery he worked for to California to look for amazing trees to bring back to plant on English estates. He heard the tale of these enormous redwoods growing, and he went and found the grove of them, and he brought them back. Now, when you find a tree for the first time, these days you'd take photographs, you'd record it digitally, but what Lobb did, and what all the Victorian plant hunters did, was make a herbarium sheet. I hope you get the chance to go and visit our herbarium. The curator, Lauren Gardner, is fantastic at explaining the herbarium and what it's used for and the amazing specimens she has there. One of the specimens she has is William Lobb's herbarium sheet of the first recording of the giant redwood. So he pressed some leaves, some seed capsules, a bit of bark. He wrote a description, he put information about where he'd found it, what it was growing with, what the habitat was like, and so on. So we have all of that information recorded. And he put a little packet of seed on it as well. And this plant is grown from the seed of that original first collection. So it's the first giant redwood grown anywhere in the world outside of its native range in California. Now in California they live to be 5,000 years old, they get big enough to drive a car through the base. We have no idea what this one will do. It's still going strong 170 years on. It's not the tallest I've seen outside of California. It's a little bit dry here in Cambridge for them. So there are some on the west coast of Scotland that grow taller, even though they're younger. But I do hope that in another 170 years' time, and 170 after that, and another 170 after that, a director will be able to stand here looking at it and saying, well, it's a living experiment. We don't know how long it will live, we don't know how tall it will grow, but it's fantastic to be able to be part of finding out. So that's the giant redwood. Now, if we then turn to my right, another favourite tree here, this is the dawn redwood, Metasequoia. It's a beautiful tree. You can see it's got really lovely green foliage, and unusually for a conifer, it's deciduous. So it'll shed that foliage, it'll go orangey brown in the autumn and fall off, and it makes beautiful colours. It's also a lovely shape, so it's a really gorgeous tree. But it's very special because these are trees that were thought to be extinct. They were known from the fossil record. They've got that very distinctive leaf foliage pattern, and they were known from the fossil record and thought to have gone extinct about 5 million years ago. And then in the 1930s, they were discovered growing perfectly happily, not knowing they were extinct, in a grove in China. Now, Harvard funded an expedition to go and collect these amazing new metasequoia samples, and that expedition set off, and it took them several years. It was obviously a difficult time to travel. They'd now got into the Second World War, and it was difficult to get across China and to get back. And in the party was a Cambridge graduate. And the story goes that at some point during his travels, having collected the seed before he got back to the US, he met a sailor who was heading back to Britain, gave him a few seed and said, "If you get back before me, will you pass those to the director of the Cambridge Botanic Garden?" So in our archives, we have a letter from the director of the Arnold Arboretum, which is the Harvard Arboretum. They have an arboretum, a tree collection rather than a botanic garden, saying that his expedition has successfully made it back and he has seed of the amazing metasequoia and would the Cambridge Botanic Garden like one. And the letter back from my predecessor saying, "You're all right, our seedling's 6 months old, it's in place by the lake, it's doing very well, thank you very much." So I'm not sure that's a good story, it's a bit of a cheat. But it's wonderful again to be able to say we have the first metasequoia growing outside the native range anywhere in the world. It's another great experiment. We've actually got lots of these around the garden and they're very popular in horticulture because they're such beautiful trees. Now, the third tree I want to show you here looks a little bit less spectacular, but it's the same sort of story as metasequoia. So this is the Wollemi pine here, and you may have heard about Wollemi because this is quite a recent story. Again, thought to be extinct in the wild and found in the late 1990s in a grove in the Blue Mountains just outside Sydney, again doing perfectly well, not knowing it was extinct. These have been distributed around the world now. They're grown a lot in cultivation, and it's a very good thing they are because the big Australian fires at the start of 2020 were very detrimental to the area in which they grow. So it's very important that they're grown in botanic gardens around the world. This is how we do our part in conserving endangered plants. The Wollemi also gives me an opportunity to say something about the conflict in running a botanic garden. So our role is to preserve endangered plants, to make them available for research and teaching, and also to show them to as many visitors as possible and to engage visitors of all sorts in the excitement of plants. So to getting people to see and feel and smell and really enjoy plants and have an appreciation for them. And to do that, we don't really want to put the plants in a cage. But this Wollemi, when it came to us fairly soon after the rediscovery, was put in place here because we wanted it near our other living fossil. And if I don't know whether you can see, but you would if you came to have a look down here, this was its original apical meristem growing here, and when it was 2 years old, a child simply got hold of it and snapped it off. We thought the tree had died. Fortunately, it survived and it's regrown from a lateral meristem. It's a lot smaller than it ought to be, but it seems to be doing fine, and we think it'll be fine now. But that's all part of that tension that we work with, because it would be a real shame for people not to be able to come and touch it and feel it and really enjoy it. And yet on the other hand, we have this duty to protect it and to make it available to scientists. So that balancing act is a large part of what my life is about day to day. We're standing on the main walk now because I want to talk to you about our founder, John Stevens Henslow, and about his research, and also about what he's really famous for, which wasn't his research at all, but for who he taught. Henslow was interested in understanding the nature of species and the variation within them. And this is in a time before evolution was articulated, before the origin of species was written, when species were thought to have been established in the first week of creation and to be essentially unchanged. But Henslow could see that that wasn't how things actually looked. Plants varied in shape and form and size. And we see that most clearly in his herbarium specimens. So he has a large herbarium collection, and when he went out collecting for that herbarium, rather than pressing one individual onto a herbarium sheet, which is what people normally did, Henslow would collect a range of plants in a particular area, from the shortest to the tallest, for instance, or the bushiest to the least bushy, and press them all on the same sheet. So he was showing that variation and questioning how much variation was allowable, at what point you stretch the limits and stop being the same species. We see the same thinking in his tree plantings here at the garden, so we're lucky enough that we still have some of his original trees alive today, and there are two of them behind me. So on my right here is one specimen of Pinus nigra, the black pine, and this is a specimen from a variety that grows in sunny places. So it grows in Sardinia, in Corsica, in Spain, in the Pyrenees, and it has a form that doesn't really have to worry about cold weather. So it has sprawling branches. Indeed, some of the lower branches that have had to come off this tree over the years used to sprawl right across the path here as if they were sunbathing. But opposite it, on the other side of the main walk, is another specimen of the same species. This is Pinus nigra again, but this one is from the Austrian Alps, and it has a snow shedding form. The canopy has a sort of downward slope to it, the needles point downwards, the branches hang downwards. It's all about shedding snow and stopping the weight of snow making damage on the tree. And so Henslow sourced these two specimens of the same species from different localities and put them opposite each other here on the main walk because he wanted to show that variation. It's all part of his questioning of how a species can have this difference in it and still be the same species. Now, Henslow's research was really interesting, but it's not what he's most famous for. He's famous for teaching Charles Darwin. So Darwin, you probably know, came to Cambridge to study theology and apparently found it quite dull. And so while he was here, he went to all of Henslow's lectures for 3 years, and at weekends he and Henslow would go off into the countryside together looking for plants. Henslow would teach him how to identify plants, how to observe them, how to make herbarium specimens of his own. And it was Henslow, as the professor of botany at Cambridge University, that was asked to nominate a naturalist to go on the voyage of the Beagle when it set off, and he nominated his recent student Darwin. And of course Darwin went on that journey, went to the Galapagos, saw what he saw, and the rest is really important history for us in biology. But it's really interesting when you're walking around the garden here and looking at some of these original tree plantings. We see similar thinking in Henslow's beeches, in Henslow's yew trees here in the garden, to think about what he was thinking when he planted them, what he said to Darwin about them, the conversations they had about what this variation meant, and how those discussions led into Darwin's thinking when he went off on that journey and saw what he saw in the Galapagos. We've come off the main walk now, and I'm standing in the middle of our systematic beds. And this is an absolutely astonishing planting that it's really worth coming to see. So it's 2 or 3 acres, the size of a small botanic garden, and it's a planting designed again by Henslow and his first curator, Andrew Murray, to show the relationships of the plants that aren't trees. So this is non-woody plants, it's herbaceous plants, annuals and perennials that live multiple years. And the idea here is that each flower bed, and you can see behind me there are many, many different flower beds, all different shapes and sizes. Each flower bed contains plants from one family of plants, and each family of plants has one bed. So that's the rule. One family, one bed, one bed, one family. The rule breaks down slightly where we have very big plant families that we have to put into multiple beds just for the gardening to make it work, because otherwise they'd be so big you wouldn't be able to get into the middle to garden. Now, they're laid out in a very special way. If you look at systematic beds, or order beds as they're often known in other botanic gardens, they're usually long, straight, rectangular beds, and the planting would start with the first plant family at the end of one rectangle, and it would move along that until you run out of plants, and then you'd start the next family and so on, and then when you get to the end of that rectangle you'd move up down onto the next one and carry on. But Murray and Henslow wanted something different here. They wanted it's like a living piece of art. The design here is based on a book from 1813 by de Candolle, a Swiss botanist working out of Geneva, who was seeing a lot of plant material coming in from explorers and who produced the first really natural classification system of the plant kingdom. He tried to work out from the morphologies of the plants who was related to who, and he produced this book, and Henslow and Murray were very impressed with the book, and they used it as the design for these systematic beds. So essentially you can start on page 1 of his book, just over the hedge boundary behind me, and you can follow the book bed by bed all the way around this planting in a spiral, and you end up in the centre where we have the monocots inside a central oval there. Now this is a fantastic design. Nowhere else in the world has anything like this. But the truth is, if you were to set out today to lay out some systematic beds, you probably wouldn't do them like this, because our understanding now of how the plant kingdom is related is a little bit different from what de Candolle had worked out based on morphology alone. So for example, his very first family, what he thought was the earliest diverging flowering plant family, is the buttercups, the Ranunculaceae, the first family over the hedge there. But they're not. They're in the eudicots, they're a more derived group of flowering plants, and those are not where you'd begin your plantings today. Now that didn't really matter to directors for a long time, but I was forced into a really interesting position about 4 years ago when the Monument Trust gave us a very large donation to develop interpretation for the systematic beds, to show people what they were here to do. And if you're going to spend the best part of £1 million interpreting something, you need to decide whether you're going to stick with what you've got or whether now's the time to modernise it. And we had a very, very big internal debate. We consulted widely around the world, asking people, should we stick with what we've got, Or is now the time to take the opportunity to replant all of this to reflect our modern understanding of plant systematics? And it was in some ways a debate about heritage versus science. What are we here for? We were initially very keen to replant. We're here to support research. Researchers from around the world use our collection, and we want them to be able to access plants in proper family groups and understand those relationships. But the more we thought about digging it up, the more uncomfortable I became. And in the end, we made the other decision. We decided that actually, there are lots of botanic gardens in the world where you can see plants growing in their currently understood family groups. But there's only one where you can see them growing in decandolian groups. And this framework, this entire landscape was designed to support that particular classification system. So we decided that we'd stick with the heritage in the plantings, but we'd use the interpretation to explain the conflict and to show you what it would have looked like if we had replanted it according to modern understanding. So it was really interesting with student practical classes at the time to actually discuss the dilemma and to have a debate about it. And generally people were about 50-50 about whether we should replant it or keep it as it was. I hope you think we've made the right decision, but let's go and have a look at the interpretation and I'll show you how that works. The first part of the interpretation is the structure that we call the rising path. It's essentially a curving path that rises up to give you a view over the systematic beds. It's really worthwhile coming and having a walk around here because it helps with an understanding of the evolution of the plant kingdom more generally. As you walk up the path, you'll find that there are places along the path where we've used the floor to tell you something about the timing of the evolution of plants. So I'm standing at the first point, about 470 million years ago, the first colonisation of the land, what the plants are that we still see today that are representative of that time, so liverworts, hornworts, mosses, and there's also slightly more detailed interpretation here at the side as well. So if you want some support for the basics of the plant evolution of onto land story, then the rising path is a good design for a lay audience, simple way of getting that. And as you walk through the path, you'll see that there are more and more of these stops that tell you a little bit more about how plants moved onto land and how the plant phylogenetic tree diversified as you go. We'll go on up to the top now, and I'll show you what you can see as you look over the beds and how we can help you understand the relationships of the flowering plants from that position. I'm at the top of the path now, and you can see behind me you get a great view of the systematic beds, and you can see a little bit more of the layout and understand Henslow and Murray's great design for them. The other reason it's great to come up here is that you can also look at the interpretation boards that we put in to explain how the systematic beds work. There are a couple here. The other one explains the beds themselves. This one actually explains to you how to read a phylogenetic tree. And there are some little questions and quizzes you can try out here using the really great tree to work out how things are related to one another. We'll go on down below next because underneath the rising path we have more detailed interpretation that explains how the systematic beds were designed and how to use them today. We're standing underneath the rising path now next to some of the interpretation, and you'll see that there are lots of panels down here that talk about how we look at the plant kingdom and how we organise it into different groups. We've got panels that talk about how this was done in Henslow's day when the garden was laid out, and panels that talk about how it's done today. So it's a really good place to come and get a feel for the history of taxonomic science and how it's done today. I just wanted to show you this panel because it shows you some of the challenges we faced when we were thinking about what to do with the systematic beds after the Monument Trust gave us their donation. So for instance, this is the walk through the systematic beds that Henslow and Murray had laid out following De Candolles's book. But over 170 years, gardeners had changed things a bit, tweaked things here and here, and this was actually the route we were left with today if we tried to follow that same path. So we clearly had to do some work to change things and to put them back to how they wanted to be, how they used to be, or to bring them forward to how they would be if we laid them out fresh today. And so for instance, the coloured panel here shows you the work we've done on one particular section to change the bed layout and to make it truer to Henslow and Murray's design, but also as useful as it can be for modern scientists. So I'm just going to move over here to this wonderful piece of three-dimensional interpretation that we put in. And it shows you the layout of all of the beds as they currently are, but it's colour-coded to represent modern relationships. So you can see that some of it works very well. In the central oval there, everything's green, and that's because Henslow correctly laid out all the monocots in the central oval, and we still agree with that planting today. But if you just look behind that, into the section that he called Thalimiflory, it contains pink blocks, blue blocks, and yellow blocks, and a grey block, and that's because actually it contains representation of what we now know to be multiple different groups of plants, but had been all lumped together under his system. I wanted to show you a label and to explain how labelling works, because labelling is one of the key things that makes a botanic garden different from any other garden. Ideally, every plant in the Botanic Garden should have a label on it. And this is our standard label design here. So if you're looking in the garden, you should find that every plant has a label, and you should also find that every label has a plant. There shouldn't be labels not attached to plants. It's kind of hard to make that happen all the time because plants die, they self-seed, and it's one of the things that we just spend a lot of time doing, trying to keep track of labelling and making sure everything's labelled. But the reason it's so important is that this label links this particular specimen in our collection to an entry in our database. And that's really what makes a botanic garden special. We're not just a pretty garden, we're a collection of specimens which are databased, recorded, analysed, studied. The label tells you the Latin name of the plant. This is Cladrastis kentuckia. It also tells you the common name, because people want to know that, so it's known as the Kentucky yellowwood. It tells you where in the world it came from, North America in this case. The little code down here tells me where we got this specimen from, so that G is garden origin. This was actually obtained from another botanic garden rather than from the wild. We have the plant family up here for basic, it's the legume family, and all importantly up here we have the accession number that links to the database. And the accession number is also informative, so what this actually tells me is that this tree came into the collection in 1978, the first 4 numbers are the year it came into the collection, and it was the 2010th accession that year, and the A means that actually there was more than one individual of this species that came in at that time, so there'll be a 1978-2010 B somewhere in the collection as well, if it's still alive. So those labels are really important. The Botanic Garden is a great place to come and see how plants adapt to different habitats. I'm standing here in front of our Mediterranean garden, our med beds, and you can see here lots of plants that are adapted to dry and hot habitats. So we see adaptations to reflect ultraviolet light, to withstand drought, and perhaps something you can't see, but I can certainly smell, lots of compounds that are there to protect the plants against herbivores as well. There's a lovely fragrance comes off this garden. You can see this kind of thinking all the way around the garden. As you look at different types of plants, you can start to think about their adaptations and how they suit them to live in different environments. A particularly good place to see that is in our glasshouse range. So we'll go in there next to have a look at some plants that survive in very, very dry habitats in the arid lands house, and some plants that like it a bit wetter in the tropical rainforest house. So this is the arid lands house in the glasshouse range, and it's a great place to come and learn about some of the adaptations that plants show when they have to grow in very dry and hot environments. If you look around and behind me, you can see that on my left, your right as you're looking, there are the cactus family. These are from the Americas, and on the other side of the house we also have plants from Africa, from the Old World, and these plants have convergently evolved sets of solutions to the problem of living somewhere hot and dry. So we see things like grey-coloured structures, so rather than bright green, they're often a grey colour that reflects light. They often lose their leaves completely. The spines of the cactuses behind me are actually derived from their leaves, and they photosynthesize using their stems. That reduces water loss and also protects the precious water they do have inside them from marauding animals. And they have other adaptations such as very deep roots or very surface spreading roots to catch water as it flows. And you can see all of those if you come and have a look round at the Arid Lands House here in the Botanic Garden. The tropical glasshouse is another great place to come and look at adaptations that plants show to different sorts of habitats. I'm here standing next to a couple of my favourites. This is coffee, and you can see the wonderful drip tips on the leaves here, these long tips to the leaves, which allow water in the hot, wet environments these plants live in to just run down the leaf and drip off the end so the plant doesn't get waterlogged. Another great set of adaptations that plants often show in hot environments are some very impressive anti-herbivore defences. This is Ceiba, the silk cotton tree, and it has these astonishing thorns, really big, chunky, spiky things on the trunk to protect it against herbivores. But you'll notice if you look at the height of them, they only go up to just above my height, just about the height perhaps that an antelope can reach. Beyond that, there's no need for that protection anymore. So it's a great place to come and see some of these adaptations, and there are hundreds and hundreds of different species in here where you can look at these different traits that plants have. I haven't been able to show you half of what there is here to see, and I do hope you'll be able to come and have a look for yourself. But I think I've given you a flavour of the Botanic Garden, what it's used for, how we use it today. Its primary role is supporting research and teaching. We send out specimens to researchers all around the world who need to access leaf material, flowers, seeds, DNA for their research projects. We also grow a lot of plants here for research projects. We have glasshouses, controlled environment growth rooms, and also outdoor research plots. And in fact, our research plots, our outdoor plots, were where Patrick Bateson did the experiments that led him to come up with the word genetics. So there's a lot of great history in that part of the garden as well. But as you can see, it's also an environment where lots of visitors come simply to enjoy themselves. And if you are here in Cambridge and the garden is open, please do think of it not only as somewhere where you can come and learn a lot, but somewhere that's great to have a walk around, to clear your head, to refresh your soul in a way. It's a really fantastic opportunity to just get outside, enjoy plants, and enjoy having a look around you. So I do hope you'll be able to come, and I hope this has been useful. Thanks for listening today.